The ruins of Duren had no roof left and hadn't for centuries. What remained stood in 3 sections: the eastern wall, mostly intact from foundation to the height of a 2nd story; the archive annex, which had kept its stone bones even when the rest of the structure collapsed; and a stretch of flagged floor between them, where the stone had cracked across the middle and grass had pushed through the gaps, slow and indifferent to the 400 years of history underneath it. Faye had been inside the annex since first light. The light came through 2 gaps in the ceiling where the original supports had rotted out, and it shifted across the floor as the sun moved, which meant she could track time without looking up. She was working the same shelf she had catalogued 3 years ago. Not because she had missed anything then, but because she had come back to verify one specific clause, and she needed the original document in hand to confirm that the wording she had memorized was accurate down to the last syllable. The documents she carried in the leather case at her feet were copies she had made on that first visit. The originals were still here, in this room, brittle pages wrapped in oilcloth, pressed into a cavity in the northern wall behind a stone that had shifted just enough with age to reveal what it had been sealing. She had not been looking for them that first time. She had been cataloging shelf by shelf, and the shifted stone had been a detail that didn't fit the wall's original pattern, and she had pressed her palm against it and felt it give. She had pulled the pages out carefully. Read the first 3 lines standing in the cold. Then she had sat down on the floor and read the rest. The genealogical record traced the Duren bloodline through 7 generations. In the 4th generation, the maternal branch diverged, and somewhere in that divergence was a correspondence to her own family line, verified against 3 independent archival sources over 2 years of subsequent work. Not a direct line, not without gaps. But the treaty's invocation clause did not require a direct line. It required documented connection to the founding bloodline, and she had spent 3 years determining whether what she had was sufficient. She believed it was. She needed to be certain of the clause's exact wording before she decided what to do with that belief. She found the passage and read it 4 times, committed each syllable to the same place in her memory where she kept every document she intended to cite. Then she wrapped the original carefully in its oilcloth, set it back in the cavity, and pressed the stone into place. She was packing her copies into the leather case when she heard the horses. Not 1 or 2. The sound came from 2 directions, from the north road and from the eastern path simultaneously, which meant whoever was arriving had sent riders to cut the exits before coming in at the main approach. She stood still and counted the rhythm. Then she crossed to the annex window and looked out. The eastern path was blocked by cavalry. She stopped counting at 12. The northern approach was worse. Infantry in a structured formation, 3 men deep across the road, advancing with the unhurried pace of a force that had already won the approach. Behind them, a banner moved in the wind. She recognized it from the border conflict records she'd read in a regional archive 8 months ago. The Varric Coalition. They had been pressing the northern frontier for 2 years. She assessed the eastern path again. 12 riders. 40 feet of open ground between her and the nearest gap in the ruins wall, and 60 more to the tree line beyond it. Flat. Exposed from every angle. Her wolf blood gave her stamina and faster healing than a full human. But she had never shifted in 26 years, and she had no combat training, and the horses were already in position. She closed the clasp on the leather case, picked it up, walked out of the annex and into the open space between the collapsed walls, where both flanks had a clear line of sight, and she stood still. The cavalry on the eastern path slowed. The infantry on the northern road kept moving, closing the remaining distance at the pace of people who knew there was no reason to hurry. Their general rode at the front. She identified him by position and by the open helm. He had the look of someone who had not needed to state his rank in a long time. He pulled up 20 feet from her. "Clear the road," he said. Faye looked at him. She held the leather case in both hands, and she said 3 words. The general's horse stepped back without instruction. Behind him, the infantry stopped. Not the stopping of a formation receiving an order. Something older, the halt of men who had heard a sound that reached past training and contacted something in the blood. She watched it move through the formation like a single cold current. Not panic, not retreat. The absolute stillness of people who had been taught since childhood what those words meant and who understood, without discussion, what advancing past them would cost every member of their lineage. The general had not moved. She watched his face. He was doing the calculation. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way his hands didn't release the reins. He was weighing the objective he had ridden here to achieve against a consequence that could not be undone. The Varrock coalition had grown up with the treaty in their bones. Every pack that signed the original compact had passed the knowledge down for 4 centuries, not as law, but as certainty. You did not advance past a legitimate invocation. The cost was not to the individual, it was to the line. He weighed it for a long time. Then he looked at her, directly, with the full attention he had been withholding since she'd walked out of the annex, and said quietly, "Who are you?" Faye said nothing. She turned and walked south at a steady pace toward the tree line she had not been able to reach before. She had calculated hesitation. She had calculated enough uncertainty to clear the ruins before the general resolved his thinking. She had not calculated that the entire formation would remain stationary while she walked, that the invocation would hold not as a threat, but as a fact, while she put 300 feet of open ground between herself and 80 armed soldiers. She kept her pace even. She was moving into the first trees when she heard a different arrival. Faster horses coming from the south and east, from the direction the Varrock coalition had left open as their own approach corridor. The direction of the kingdom's defense. She stopped inside the tree line and looked back through the gap in the ruins. She could see the frozen Varrock formation and, arriving at the southern edge at the controlled speed of cavalry that had been riding hard, a column of the kingdom's soldiers. She recognized the banner. She had read it across enough border documents over 3 years to know what it meant without looking twice. The Crown's military command. She needed approximately 4 seconds to determine whether she should stay in the trees or step out of them. The column parted. A single rider came through. She couldn't see his face at this distance. She could see his bearing, the way the formation organized itself around him without visible instruction, the way every soldier tracked his position with the peripheral awareness of men who had learned that he moved quickly when he decided to move. He pulled up at the edge of the ruins and looked at the frozen Varrock formation. Then his attention shifted. He looked directly at the tree line. He said something to the rider at his shoulder. 6 soldiers spread immediately in a wide arc toward her position. Faye stepped out of the trees. She waited until the soldiers were close enough to hear her clearly. "I'm not armed. The case contains documents. I'm a researcher." "Stay where you are," the lead soldier said. She had already stopped. Behind the soldiers, the rider had dismounted and was crossing the ground between them. He moved without rushing and covered ground quickly. By the time his soldiers reached her, he was 30 feet back and closing. He was taller than she had measured from a distance, broader through the shoulder. He moved with the contained energy of someone who had long ago stopped performing stillness. The amber eyes in his face were direct and did not waver. She felt his wolf reach across the distance before he had finished crossing it. Not aggression. She knew that pressure well, had grown up feeling alpha presence like heat before an open flame, the unconscious assertion of rank that powerful wolves carried without noticing. This was nothing like that. It did not push. It did not assert. It arrived, and it was searching for something she had no framework to name, and the recognition of it settled somewhere in her chest she did not examine. She did not look away from him. "Roran," she said. The banner was identification enough, and she had read his name across enough documents in 3 years to place him without ceremony. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, a reaction he chose not to finish. "You stopped an invasion," he said. "I stopped an advance force for approximately 3 hours. They will have sent word to the main formation by now. Whatever the invocation created, it is a window." "How?" "I invoked the founding treaty, the Duran Border Compact. 400 years old. The invocation requires a documented heir of the founding line and the correct name, spoken at the border in the presence of witnesses. That treaty has not been. It has never been revoked, she said. It was removed from the court archives approximately 60 years ago. That is not the same thing. Silence. The case, he said. The documentation. The original treaty and the genealogical record that establishes my connection to the founding line. Plus 3 supporting documents. He studied her. Then he turned to the soldier on his left. Secure tent. She comes to camp. A pause, and then back to her. The case stays with you. She noted that. I have a condition, she said. I speak to you directly, not to officers I haven't met. Penn, the beta whose name she would learn an hour later, made a sound behind Roran's shoulder. Roran didn't look at him. Agreed, he said. She fell in step with the soldiers. The camp was half a mile south of the ruins, set back from the road into a shallow depression that provided cover from the northern approach. Larger than a field camp, organized into proper rows, supply lines visible at the eastern edge. They had been here long enough to build structure. They had known the Varric coalition was coming. She was taken to a tent near the camp's center. 2 soldiers posted at the entrance. Not a prison tent. There was a cot, a small table, water that appeared without her asking. She sat at the table and opened the case, spreading the documents in the order she intended to present them. The treaty first. The genealogical record second. The 3 supporting documents establishing the chain from the founding compact to the morning's invocation. She was reviewing the 3rd document when the tent flap opened. Roran came in alone. No armor now. Dark shirt, sleeves rolled back, the same directness he had carried across the open ground outside. He sat across the table from her without ceremony, looked at the spread of documents, and said, "Start from the beginning." Faye set her hands flat on the table. 3 years ago, she said, I found a cavity in the archive annex of the Duren ruins. Inside were the original records of the founding compact, the treaty, the genealogical registers, and 3 supporting documents. The Duren line did not end with the pack. It continued through the maternal branch, and I have documented my connection to that branch through 3 independent archival sources. Roran's eyes moved over the documents. He didn't reach for them. You came back today to verify the clause, to verify the exact wording before I decided what to do with what I have. She met his eyes. The army's arrival was not part of the plan, but you used it. I calculated hesitation. I intended to use the hesitation to clear the ruins. She let a beat pass. Instead, they stopped entirely. He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face was very still, not surprise, but the careful attention of someone taking the full measure of new information. The treaty should be in the court archives, he said. It is not. Penn will confirm that the records were removed, not lost. The distinction matters legally. Roran looked at her across the documents between them. You're coming to the capital, he said. Yes, with the same conditions I stated. The documents stay with you. You work in the archives with full access. You report to me directly. He stood. At the tent entrance, he paused. We move at first light. He left. The tent flap settled behind him. Outside, the camp moved through its evening rhythms, controlled, low, the sounds of a force that had been in the field long enough to stop being loud about it. Faye began sorting the documents back into the leather case in the order she intended to work with them. The genealogical record went in last. She pressed the clasp closed. Tomorrow, the capital, the court archives. Whatever had been removed from them 60 years ago, and the trail it had left behind. She set the case flat on the table within reach. The morning they moved camp, the Varric formation had retreated 6 miles north. Penn reported it at first light, pulled back the tent flap, and delivered the information the way he delivered everything, without inflection, without preamble. 6 miles, compact formation. Not dispersed, not advancing. Roran was already dressed. He looked at Faye across the tent, where she sat at the table with the documents ordered in front of her, the leather case open to her left. The invocation holds at distance, she said. the treaty doesn't specify a radius of effect. It specifies conditions of activation. How long does it hold? The clause reads, until answered or abandoned. The coalition has done neither. Penn made a sound behind Roran's shoulder. She was already learning to read him. That particular sound was his version of a reaction he had decided not to voice aloud. Roran said nothing. He picked up his sword belt from the camp chair and buckled it without looking down, the movement automatic and practiced. Then, he looked at her once more, a brief and direct assessment. We ride in an hour. The journey to the capital took 3 days. Faye rode in the middle of the formation, not at the front with the command, not at the rear with the supply line, but somewhere in the deliberate middle that could have been precaution or courtesy, and she had not yet decided which. Roran rode at the head. He did not come back along the column to speak with her on the first day or the second. Penn checked on her at each stop with a regularity that told her it had been requested rather than chosen. She spent the riding hours working through the documents in her memory. She had memorized the originals on that first visit 3 years ago. Every word, the ink color of the founding signatures, the precise crease patterns in the parchment that distinguished the founding document from its later annotations. On horseback, with open road unrolling ahead and the formation steady around her, she ran through the genealogical record clause by clause, identifying the points where the chain of proof was strongest, noting the 3 places where a skilled archivist could raise a challenge. She had answers for 2 of those points. The third required external corroboration, a source untouched by whatever had happened to the court's records. That was a problem she would address when she had a clearer picture of how much had been removed and how deliberately. On the 3rd morning, the capital appeared on the horizon as the sun came up fully. Stone walls catching the early light along the upper edges, towers in 4 positions, smoke from the inhabited districts beyond the outer gate, larger than she had expected. The maps she had used were military-purpose documents built for movement and approach corridors, not for conveying the actual weight of a city. Penn pulled his horse alongside hers as they neared the outer gate. He looked forward, not at her, when he spoke. About 60 people in the inner court, half functionaries, quarter the Alpha King's people, quarter council members or their staff. A pause. They will have heard something by now. The border, the invocation, a woman researcher. Another pause. I'm not telling you this as a warning, just as information. Thank you, she said. He nodded and pulled ahead without further comment. The gate opened before the formation reached it. The courtyard inside was large and organized. Stable yards east, training ground west, the main entrance to the palace straight ahead. Stone and dark timber with no decorative intent. A building built for its function and unchanged by it. At the top of the entrance steps, a man waited. She placed him above 70, though he stood with the careful posture of someone who had long since stopped letting his body signal age. White hair, close cut. A face that had settled into authority through decades of repetition, through rooms full of people deciding whether to trust him and almost always concluding that they did. He wore no ceremonial dress, dark clothing, well-made, a single ring on his right hand. His attention was on her before she had finished crossing the courtyard. Not on Roran, who was dismounting 20 feet to her left. Not on the formation, still flowing through the gate behind her. Her. She walked to the foot of the steps and climbed them at a steady pace. Welcome to the capital. His voice was measured and carried a warmth that was technically indistinguishable from genuine warmth. I am Severin, chief advisor to the crown. He extended his hand. She took it. His grip was brief, calibrated to the precise middle of every readable meaning. Firm enough to signal respect, loose enough to signal no assertion of power. The handshake of someone who had spent 40 years ensuring that no gesture could be read the wrong way. Faye, she said. Thank you. The archives have been arranged for your use. We have a number of documents that may be relevant to your area of work. A small pause. We would be glad to assist wherever possible. I'll let you know what I need. The response came back completely smooth, a slight incline of the head, a gesture toward the entrance. Of course, I'll have someone show you to your quarters. Roran had come up the steps behind her. "Pen will take her," he said. To Faye, without ceremony. "Rest today. Archives are yours from first light tomorrow." Severin inclined his head again. Faye followed Pen inside. Her quarters were 2 rooms on the palace's eastern corridor, a workroom with a wide table and north-facing light, and a smaller sleeping room behind it. The bookshelf held a set of blank ledgers and 3 reference volumes she recognized as standard archival tools. The fire had been lit before her arrival. She put the leather case on the table and stood at the window instead of opening it. The courtyard below was settling back into its ordinary pace, formation dispersing, horses being led to the stables, 2 officers walking with Roran toward the east wing in active conversation. From this angle, she could see the slight adjustment he made when he disagreed with something being reported to him. A turn of the head, barely visible, before he responded. Not a dismissal. A recalibration. She pulled her attention from the window and sat at the table. Pen opened the archive at first light without ceremony, and she started at the end. Working backward through a collection told her what the collection considered important, what had been preserved with care versus what had been kept out of administrative habit. The court archive occupied 3 connected rooms in the northeast wing, all shelved floor to ceiling, each with a central work table. The organization was primarily chronological, secondarily by subject matter, standard for an institution of this age. She set her blank ledger on the work table of the 3rd room and began. 2 hours in, Roran arrived. He came without announcement. She registered this because Pen was not with him, which meant he had not informed Pen of his intention to come. He stood in the entrance of the 3rd room and looked at the documents she had spread across the central table. "You start from the far end," he said. "It's more efficient. Recent records tell me what the archive chose to keep, which tells me as much as the documents themselves." He came into the room. He did not sit. He moved along the shelves with the particular attention of someone taking the measure of a space before deciding how to use it. He stopped at the section she had marked with a strip of blank paper. That section. Border records from 40 to 70 years ago. I'm looking for the Durin records or the shape of their absence. Pen is pulling the inventory records today. Good. Comparing the written inventory to what's physically present will tell us whether the removal was documented or whether someone removed the record of the removal as well. He turned from the shelf and looked at her directly. "You speak about this without any—" He stopped. "Without what?" "I was going to say, without alarm." "Alarm slows analysis," she said. "I'm better at analysis." A beat. He crossed to the near end of the work table and stood with his arms folded, reading the documents she had already processed. She turned back to the unreviewed stack. 4 minutes passed in silence. This one. He pointed to a land grant record near the edge of the processed pile. "The eastern boundary here differs from the current boundary record I have." She looked at where he was pointing. "By how much?" 30 miles, into what is currently Allied territory." She picked up the land grant and read the boundary description twice. Then she moved it to a separate position on the table, apart from both the processed stack and the unreviewed material, and uncapped her pencil. "When were the current boundaries formalized?" 53 years ago. She wrote the document reference, the date, the boundary discrepancy, and the date of the current boundary formalization. Then she placed the page on top of the land grant and returned to the shelves. Neither of them commented on the arithmetic. Pen's confirmation came that afternoon. He found them both in the 2nd archive room and reported without adjustment for what the information would mean. The Durin lineage records appear in the written inventory as present. They are not present on the shelves. The inventory entry was amended. The original entry is visible underneath the amendment if you hold the page at an angle to the light. The amendment gives no reason for removal. Only a date. "What date?" Faye said. 61 years ago. 3rd month. She wrote it in the ledger. "The amendment is initialed, not signed," Pen continued. "I can have the court calligrapher compare the initials against records from the same period." "Do that," Roran said. Pen left. The room was quiet. Roran turned to look at the shelves, not at her, not at any specific document. His jaw held the set she had already learned to recognize. Not anger, but the thing that came before it. When a man who had spent 12 years making territorial decisions realized that some of those decisions had been built over ground he had not known was hollow. She did not address it. She turned back to her work and let him have the silence for what it was. The days that followed built a rhythm neither of them named. She arrived at the archive at first light. She worked through the morning. Roran arrived sometime after. No stated reason, no announced departure time. He stayed 2 to 3 hours, asked specific questions about what she had found, and left. Penn proceeded through the inventory comparison methodically, cross-referencing the written record against the physical shelves section by section, and reported his findings to both of them. On the 4th day, Roran asked, "What do you think was taken?" The Duren records were the largest single removal, but they were not the only one. She set down the document she was holding. There are 3 other gaps in the border records from the same period, smaller, less obvious, consistent with the same approach. Someone who knew this archive's structure and pulled only what was necessary to make the Duren records impossible to corroborate independently. They anticipated that someone would look. They anticipated that someone could look. Whether they expected it to happen 61 years later is a different question. He looked at her for a moment. She picked up the next document. "How did you end up doing this work?" he said. The question had no obvious strategic purpose. She registered that before answering. "I grew up in Vial Pack. Small, southern, a reasonable wall of donated texts in the council room. I had read everything in it by the time I was 14. She turned a page. The work I wanted to do existed outside Vial. So at 19, I left. They allowed that. I didn't ask." She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not assessment, not the focused attention he brought to documents and tactical reports. Something less categorized than that. She returned to the document in her hands. "There is a secondary archive 2 days east," she said, "a pack that predates the removal. If the court records were altered, an independent source from the same period may have copies of the Duren documentation." "Not yet," he said. "There's more to pull from here first." She had expected immediate agreement. She adjusted. He was sequencing the work, wanting a clearer picture of the internal record's condition before going outside it for comparison. That was sound method. She nodded and kept working. On the 9th day, she found the first replacement, not a missing document. A document that should not have been there, a land registry entry dated to the removal period, recording a boundary formalization between 2 territories with 3 council signatures. Nothing irregular on its surface. But she had spent 8 days reading the handwriting patterns of this archive, and the ink in the boundary description was subtly different from the rest of the page. A fraction warmer in tone, the pen pressure heavier, the strokes slightly wider. 2 people had written this page. The boundary description had been added after the rest. She sat still with the document in her hands for a long time. She looked at the boundary description and then at the surrounding text and then at the boundary description again. Then she placed it on the separate pile, the one that had accumulated to 13 items across 9 days, and opened her ledger. She wrote what she had observed. The ink variation, the pressure difference, the line of demarcation between the 2 hands. She did not write what it meant. What it meant was legible from what she had observed, and adding the conclusion would have been unnecessary. When Roran came in, she gestured at the pile. "These are not missing records," she said. "These are altered ones." He crossed to the table and looked at the pile without touching it. Then he sat down directly across from her, the first time he had sat rather than stood, and said, "Show me." She took him through each document. The ink discrepancies, the handwriting shifts that crossed mid-sentence, the dates that did not correspond to the physical age of the paper. She showed him where a boundary clause had been inserted into a document that predated it by 2 decades. She showed him what the archive would look like to someone who had no reason to examine it this closely, and what it looked like to someone who did. He listened without interrupting once. When she finished, the silence ran for several seconds. "This was built deliberately," he said. Yes. Over time. Over several years, based on the range of dates, with enough care to survive routine examination indefinitely. She looked at the pile between them. It only shows what it is when you know what was supposed to be here in the first place. He sat back and looked at the pile of altered documents. His face had the quality of someone recalculating something fundamental, not panicked, but thorough. Roran was a man who had inherited a war and fought it for 12 years on information he had been given reason to trust. She understood, without needing to be told, that this was the first clear moment in which he understood that some of that information had been built on a deliberate foundation. She did not say anything about it. "What do you need next?" he said. "The external archive. I cannot fill the remaining gaps from inside a record set that has been altered at the source. I need an independent document from the same period, held by a source that had no reason to alter it." This time, without hesitation. 2 days to prepare the departure. Faye turned to the next document on the unreviewed stack. Outside the archive, the palace moved through its evening. Footsteps in the corridor, a brief exchange of voices near the wing entrance, then quiet. Inside, the 2 oil lamps on the work table held their steady light against the darkening windows. Roran did not leave immediately. He pulled a document from the unreviewed stack and turned it over. "The boundary notation here," he said. "Is it one of yours?" She leaned across and looked. "Not processed yet. I haven't reached that section." He set it back on the stack. He remained at the table, reading in silence while she continued working, until the corridor outside had gone fully quiet and the lamps needed trimming. The 3rd week began the way the first 2 had ended, with Faye at the work table before the archive lamps needed lighting, and Pen arriving at the door with the morning's inventory comparison before she had finished her first review pass. But the 3rd week was different in a way she had not anticipated and could not fully account for. Roran stopped arriving with questions. In the first 2 weeks, he had come with specific things he needed to understand: boundary discrepancies, dating anomalies, the implications of an altered document on the legal standing of a territorial agreement. The questions had been targeted and strategic. She had answered them. He had processed the answers and used them. That was a transaction she understood and was comfortable inside. Now he arrived without stated purpose and stayed without announced departure, and the work continued around him, her at the central table, him at the secondary shelf, or standing near the window with a document in hand. And the questions that came were different, less targeted, more like the questions of someone trying to understand not just the facts of a thing, but the architecture underneath the facts. "The Duran Compact was one of 5 founding agreements," he said, on the 3rd day of the 3rd week. He was standing at the shelf she had designated as the altered documents section, looking at the copies she had organized there. "The other 4? Are they intact?" 3 appear intact, based on what I've reviewed. The 4th has 2 sections I haven't fully reconciled. "The Marin Agreement." She looked up. "You know it. It governs the Eastern Corridor. I've used it in 3 negotiations in the past 5 years. She turned back to the page she was holding. "I'll review that section next." A pause. Then, "What does the Duran Compact's invocation clause require, exactly?" "I told you at the camp." "You told me the conditions. I want to understand the mechanism." She put the document down. "The clause requires spoken invocation of the founding name by a documented heir of the Duran line at a border established by the original compact in the presence of witnesses. It does not require the heir to be known as an heir. It does not require announcement of intent. It activates on bloodline and correct form. So when the coalition stopped, they stopped because their founding lore told them to. The treaty is older than any living memory, but it was passed down as functional knowledge. Every major pack on this continent knows what the Duran invocation sounds like and what it means to advance past it. And you knew that before you spoke the words. I calculated on it, but not on the extent of it." "No," she said, "not on the extent." He was quiet for a moment. She found over those weeks that his silences were readable, different from each other in a way that most people's silences were not. This one had the quality of someone who respected an honest answer precisely because they had expected a more managed version of it. He did not say that. He picked up the next document on the shelf and began reading. She returned to the Marin Agreement. On the 6th day, she finished the primary review of the altered documents and started on the secondary analysis, cross-referencing the replacements against the surrounding records to determine the scope of what had been changed. The pattern held consistently, a central removal of the Duren documentation, surrounded by a ring of smaller alterations that would have made independent verification impossible from within the archive. Someone had understood both what they were hiding and what tools a future researcher might use to find it. She wrote it up in the ledger without editorial commentary. 17 pages of documented evidence, organized in sequence from the earliest alteration to the most recent, with the Duren records sitting at the center of the map like the point from which all the other movements radiated. She showed Roran the completed ledger on the 7th day. He read it cover to cover at the work table across from her without speaking. She continued with her own work. When he closed the ledger, she looked up. The removal was not a single decision, she said. It was a policy, maintained across time. Which means more than one person knew. Which means at minimum one person knew in each period where an alteration appears. Whether they were the same person throughout or a succession of custodians, I cannot determine from inside this archive. He rested both hands flat on the ledger. You are describing a 60-year institutional effort to erase a legal claim. I am describing the documented evidence. What it describes is your conclusion to draw. He looked at her. You always do that. Do what? Stop before the conclusion. The conclusion is obvious from the evidence. My saying it adds nothing to your understanding and removes the work from your judgment. These are decisions about your kingdom. Something in his face shifted. Not surprise, exactly. More like the recognition of something he had not expected to encounter in this particular form, in this particular room. He set the ledger aside. The calligrapher confirmed the initials, he said. The amendment that covered the original Duren inventory entry was made by the same hand as 6 other administrative amendments from the same year. He paused. The hand belonged to the chief advisor of that period. Severin's father, she said. It was not a question. She had reached that conclusion 3 days ago and had been waiting for the corroboration. Roran held her gaze. Yes, she was in her quarters that evening, working through her notes on the Marin Agreement, when a messenger knocked and delivered a formal request. Chief Advisor Severin wished to speak with her at her convenience. The language of the note was courteous and unhurried, the phrasing of someone who had spent decades ensuring that nothing he put in writing could be read as pressure. She went the following afternoon. Severin's receiving room was on the West Wing's 2nd floor, a large space that had been furnished to communicate gravity without discomfort. Books on 3 walls, organized by use rather than display. A fire that was appropriate for the temperature rather than for effect. He rose when she entered, gestured to the chair across from his, and waited until she had settled before sitting. Thank you for coming, he said. I understand you have been making considerable progress in the archive. The work is going well. Good. He folded his hands in his lap. The ring on his right hand caught the firelight briefly. I have been thinking about how to be of use to you. I have some familiarity with the history of the collection, its gaps, its organizational logic. It seemed worth a conversation. She waited. He studied her for a moment, with the slight recalibration of someone who had expected a different opening response. I will be direct, he said. I believe you are a researcher of exceptional ability. What you have accomplished in 3 weeks represents years of standard archival work. A pause. I would like to propose a formal arrangement. I'm listening. The court has no permanent position for a historical researcher of your specialization. That is an oversight I would like to correct. He spoke evenly, without the texture of someone who was performing sincerity, or without it obviously enough to read. A formal appointment as court archivist with full and permanent access to the collection, an annual stipend, reviewed upward at your discretion, resources for the external preservation work you do on extinct pack records. She said nothing. These are not small things, he continued. You have been working as an independent researcher for 7 years. The security of a permanent position and the access that comes with it would substantially expand the scope of what you can accomplish. The fire shifted. She watched it. In exchange, she said. He inclined his head slightly. The Duren Compact has significant territorial implications. The boundaries it establishes, if reasserted as active legal claims rather than historical documents, would require a restructuring of arrangements that currently underpin the stability of this kingdom and its alliances. Not because those arrangements are unjust, he said carefully, but because the disruption of established structures, even just ones, carries costs that fall on the people within them. A pause. I am asking that the Duren material be treated as what it formally is, a historical record of extraordinary significance, properly preserved and documented, not as the basis for active legal action. She looked at him. He held her gaze with the ease of someone who had made this kind of request before and had calibrated it to the point where it rarely sounded like what it was. I'll consider it, she said. He nodded, as if that were the response he had expected. They spoke for a few more minutes about the archive's external acquisitions process, a conversation she engaged with fully and attentively because the information was relevant and because the transition out of the proposal needed to be ordinary. When she left, she walked back to the archive rather than her quarters. She had the ledger out and was adding 3 new pages of notes when Roran arrived 20 minutes later. You have something, he said from the entrance. I had a meeting with Severin. She did not look up. He offered me a formal court appointment, permanent archive access, and an annual stipend. The room was very quiet. In exchange for treating the Duren material as historical record only, not as the basis for legal claim. She turned a page. His argument was that restructuring established arrangements, even unjust ones, carries costs to the people within them. It is not a stupid argument. He went around me. He went around both of us, technically. He has been watching the direction of the research. She set down the pencil. He knew before I walked into this archive what the Duren records meant for the territorial structure. When I invoked the treaty at the border, he understood what it was before you did, because he had been waiting for 61 years for something like that to happen. Roran came fully into the room. He did not sit. He made the offer before you reported the initials confirmation to me, she said. I don't know if that timing was intentional or if he had already scheduled the meeting. It's relevant either way. What did you tell him? That I would consider it. She met his eyes. I have not considered it. I came here directly. The offer is on the table, and you needed to know it exists before either of us takes another step. The silence ran long enough that she could hear the fire in the corridor brazier outside the archive door. He was 10 years old, Roran said finally. He had read the calligrapher's report and processed the arithmetic. She knew he had. Yes, he did not make the decision. No, but he has been maintaining it for 61 years. Those are different things, and they are both true. He stood at the end of the table and looked at the ledger without reading it. She watched his face in her peripheral vision. Not the controlled set of the command face, the one that had accompanied every strategic decision she had seen him make in 3 weeks. Something more interior than that. A man arriving at an understanding he had been approaching slowly and was now standing inside. What else, he said. She turned to the second page of new notes. 3 incidents over the past week. On the 14th, a group of documents I had organized on the secondary table were relocated to an unlabeled shelf overnight. The arrangement was too specific to be a maintenance error. They were moved by document type, which corresponds to how I categorize, not how this archive is organized. Someone who watched me work moved them. He was fully still. On the 16th, the guard rotation at the archive entrance was changed without Penn's authorization. Penn caught it because the replacement guard was assigned from a posting not under his direct command. The change lasted 4 hours before Penn reversed it. She turned the page. On the 18th, a member of the Eastern Council paid me a visit in the archive. A courtesy call, he said. 40 minutes of conversation that included 4 specific questions about the dating methodology I used to establish document age. She closed the ledger. None of these events are definitive individually. Together they have a consistent character. Someone testing what I know, what I can prove, and how easily my work can be disrupted without direct confrontation. She looked up. The same person who made me a formal offer of significant value is applying minor pressure at the edges. That tells me the offer was not confident. It was an attempt to resolve a problem he is not certain he can resolve otherwise. Roran absorbed this. You recorded all of it. In the ledger. Date, time, observed detail, contextual notes. No conclusions. He picked up the ledger and held it for a moment without opening it. Then he set it back on the table and straightened. Penn will change the archive guard assignment tonight. Full rotation under his direct command. He moved toward the door. The council member's name. Aldrich, Eastern Territories, 3rd seat. Roran nodded once. He stopped at the door and looked back. The offer, he said. From Severin. I'm not considering it. I know, he said. I wanted to hear you say it. He left. She turned back to the ledger and opened it to the next blank page. Outside, the afternoon had moved into early evening without her noticing. The light in the archive had gone from white to amber, and the air had the close quality of a room that had been occupied all day. She trimmed the lamp closest to her and continued writing. The external archive was 2 days east. She had flagged it to Roran on the 9th day of the 2nd week. He had said 2 days to prepare. That was 6 days ago. She knew why the delay existed. In those 6 days, the archive guard had been compromised. Her organized documents had been handled by someone who understood enough to be careful. And a council member had come to measure the edges of her method by asking precisely the wrong questions. Leaving too early would have meant moving while the archive was still porous and the destination too easily inferred. If Roran delayed, he delayed because he intended to lock down the route before anyone else could reach for it. That was strategy, not neglect. It did not make the waiting feel shorter. She wrote a note at the bottom of the page. Eastern Archive. Timing. She capped her pencil and looked at what she had built across 3 weeks. 17 documented replacements, a 6-decade pattern of maintained removal, a confirmed link to the current chief advisor's family, and a formal offer of purchase that had inadvertently confirmed how much Severin understood about what she had. She closed the ledger, stood, crossed to the shelves, and stood in front of the altered documents section for a moment. The copies, organized in sequence, the chain of evidence visible in the arrangement itself. Then she put out the lamp and walked back to her quarters through the quiet corridor. They left the Capitol before sunrise on the 2nd day after the archive guard changed. Faye had expected a smaller escort. 4 riders, perhaps 6, enough to move quickly without drawing attention. What waited in the lower courtyard was not a convoy, but it was more than caution required. 12 mounted soldiers, 2 pack horses, Penn already at the front, and Roran beside his horse with gloves in one hand and a folded document map in the other. She stopped at the foot of the steps and took in the arrangement once, from the order of the horses to the distribution of weapons. This is not subtle, she said. No, Penn replied. He said nothing else. His expression did not change, but the pause after the word was fractionally longer than usual, and that was enough to tell her he had opinions he had no intention of offering aloud. Roran handed her the folded map. Eastern route. The archive sits inside Halvern territory. 2 days if the roads hold. She opened the map. The route was clean. A single river crossing on the first day, forest on both sides of the road after noon, then open country before the Halvern walls. You've marked the alternate road. Flood damage last month. If the lower road is still soft, we take the ridge. She folded the map again and tied it to her saddlebag. How many people know where we're going? Penn, me, 2 quartermasters who prepared the route. He took his horse's reins and looked at her directly. No one else needed the destination. That was answer enough. They rode out through the east gate while the city still held the silence before trade carts and messengers filled the roads. The outer streets were nearly empty. A baker opening shutters, 2 stable boys hauling water, a woman sweeping stone steps with both hands on the broom. By the time they reached the lower road, the capital had fallen behind them into pale morning light and distance. For the first hour, the formation held. Penn at the front, 4 riders behind him, Faye near the middle, Roran slightly ahead and to her left. The remaining soldiers spread along the rear and flanks, not ceremonial, defensive. She spent most of the first morning reviewing the ledger in her head, the inventory amendment, the altered land records, the copied boundary clauses, the sequence of removals. The one question she could not answer from inside the court archive sat at the center of all of it: whether any outside archive had received the original Durin records before they disappeared into the court's custody. By midday, they reached the river crossing. The bridge was old stone and still held. Penn checked it himself before allowing the horses onto it. The column crossed in silence, hooves striking the surface in steady rhythm. Roran fell back beside her on the far side. "You've gone over the Halvern likelihood 3 times since we left the walls," he said. She looked at him. 4. That almost smile appeared again, brief and unfinished. "What are the odds?" "High that they have some record of the request. Lower that they retained a full duplicate set. Moderate that they retained the transmittal ledger." She adjusted her reins. "Very high that if anything survives, it will answer more than one question. Because archives don't lose only one thing. Because removal leaves shape behind it, even when the document is gone." He nodded once and rode in silence beside her for another stretch of road. The first day's camp was set in a clearing just above the ridge road, where the trees opened enough to give sightlines in every direction. The soldiers worked fast. Tether lines, fire pit, bedroll positions, perimeter rotation. Faye unsaddled her own horse before anyone could offer to do it for her and took the ledger from her saddlebag to the flat stone at the edge of camp. She had just opened it when a shadow crossed the page. Roran stood there with 2 tin cups. "Penn says if I leave you alone with your notes on the first night, you'll work until the fire dies." "That is a reasonable assessment." He handed her one of the cups, water, still cool from the skin bag. Then he sat on the stone beside her without asking whether the space was meant to remain empty. For a moment he said nothing. He looked out over the tree line, then down at the open ledger on her lap. "Show me the sequence again." So she did. Not because he needed the information for the first time. He already knew the outline. But here, away from the court, the explanation moved differently. No walls holding the echo of other people's authority. No corridor outside the archive door. No sense that each sentence might be overheard and carried somewhere it should not go. She showed him the dates, the spacing between the altered entries, the years where nothing had been touched because nothing needed touching, the years where several documents had been adjusted in close succession, which suggested either review or panic. He listened with the same concentration he gave to campaign reports. When she finished, he took the ledger carefully and turned back 2 pages. "You noted the years with clustered changes," he said. "Those are the years I want to compare first against the Halvern ledgers." He traced a line beneath one entry with his thumb but did not touch the ink. "You built this in 3 weeks. Not this part. And the rest." She looked at him. "The rest took 7 years. He looked down at the ledger again. "I know." Her attention caught on the sentence longer than the words alone should have warranted. That stayed with her longer than it should have. Not the words themselves. The fact that he had said them without flattening the years into something convenient and admirable. Not a compliment, not surprise. Recognition, clean and exact. She took the ledger back and closed it. The fire had burned lower. Around them, the camp had settled into evening watch patterns. Penn crossed the clearing once, checked the eastern perimeter, and vanished into the dark beyond the last circle of firelight. "You should sleep," Roran said. "So should you." He stood. She expected him to leave then. Instead, he took the ledger from her hands, set it on the folded blanket beside her, and said, "Tomorrow we reach Halvern before dusk." Then he walked back toward his own bedroll. She watched him go for 1 second too long and then looked away. They reached Halvern on the second evening. The Allied territory did not have the capital's scale. It had walls built for defense and repaired where necessary, a gatehouse with practical carpentry, stone houses inside the inner ring, and an archive attached to the council hall instead of housed separately. Old enough to matter, small enough that record-keeping would not have been split across too many hands. The Halvern archivist met them in the council chamber before the horses were fully seen to. Her name was Tessa, 50, perhaps a little older. Dark hair bound at the nape, ink staining the side of her left hand. She looked at Roran first, because rank required it, then at Faye, because the work required it, and the second look lasted longer. "You sent no detailed notice," she said to Roran. "By design." Tessa's gaze shifted once between them and then returned to Faye. "What are you looking for?" "A request from the Crown Court 61 years ago concerning Durin records," Faye said. "Preferably the transmittal ledger, any copy of the request itself, and any notation of non-return." Tessa's eyebrows moved a fraction. "That's specific. Because we're not guessing." Tessa considered that for less than a second. "Come." The Halvern archive occupied 2 long rooms with a narrow annex between them. No ceremony, no wasted space. Shelves packed close, aisles tighter than the capitals. Faye knew within 30 seconds that the place had been used continuously and by people who expected their records to matter later. She and Tessa worked the first room while Roran remained near the central table reading the index volumes as they were brought down. Penn stationed 2 soldiers outside and 1 at the inner door. He did not interfere with the work. He simply arranged the space so the work could continue without interruption. The transmittal ledgers were shelved by year. Tessa brought down the volume for the 61st year first, then the one before it, then the one after. The answer came faster than Faye had expected. "There," she said. Tessa leaned across the table. The entry sat midway down the page, neat, unembellished, impossible to misread once found. Crown request for temporary transfer of Durin Border Compact records, genealogical register, and related annex documents for central archival review. Authorized under seal of the Chief Advisor to the Crown. A receiving signature. A date. Faye turned the page, then the next. No return entry. She looked up. Roran was already at the opposite side of the table. "Read it to me." She did. Every word. Then she set her finger beneath the signature line. The name belonged to the chief advisor of that period, Severin's father. Tessa went to the annex and returned with the corresponding copy file. The request itself had been preserved in Halvern's records because outgoing transfers of founding documents required duplicate retention under Allied protocol. The copy bore the same name, the same authorization, the same date, 3 attached items listed by number. "Do you have the attached inventory list?" Faye asked. Tessa opened the file again. Yes, she did. The Durin materials had existed. Not in rumor, not in reconstructed memory. In documented transfer from Halvern custody into Crown custody 61 years earlier, with itemized record of what had been sent, and no notation that any of it had ever been returned. Faye read the list twice, then once more. Roran watched her face across the table. "What?" She set the page down carefully. This is enough. It was more than enough. It did not merely confirm that the Crown had removed the records. It confirmed that the Allied territories had possessed copies and that the Crown had formally requested transfer. It turned suspicion into chain. It closed the largest gap. Tessa looked between them. "Who exactly are you proving this to?" "Not tonight," Roran said. That ended the question. They were given rooms inside the east wing of the council hall. 2 floors up, narrow corridor, shutters against the courtyard. The soldiers took the outer hall and the stairwell. Penn checked both windows himself, then left them to the relative privacy permitted by a building full of alert people. Faye did not go to her room immediately. She took the copied request, the transmittal ledger notes, and her own ledger to the small workroom off the corridor and spread everything across the table. She was still writing when the door opened and Roran stepped in. He had changed out of the road coat. Dark shirt again. No sword belt this time, though the knife remained at his side. He looked at the pages, then at her, and said, "You haven't eaten." "I know." He set a plate on the table beside the documents. Bread, hard cheese, sliced apple. Nothing warm, everything quick. She reached for the bread without looking away from the copied request. "Thank you." He dragged the second chair closer and sat. He reached for the duplicate request copy without comment and began reading. For several minutes, the room held only the sound of paper turning. Faye wrote out the sequence in her ledger, stripping it down to its strongest line. Halvern possession. Crown request. Itemized transfer. No return. Court archive removal. Inventory amendment. Subsequent replacements. 61 years of maintained absence. Beside her, Roran turned the request over and read it again. "The signature," he said quietly. "His father's." "Yes." He would have been 10. Old enough to remember the day. Old enough to know the records came in and never came back. She stopped writing and looked at the page between them. Not the architect, the witness who grew into the keeper. Roran said nothing. She continued, because the shape of it had finished forming while she wrote. "When I spoke the invocation at the border, he understood before anyone else because he had spent his life guarding the absence. He recognized what survived." Roran's hand rested on the edge of the page, broad, still. "And what survives?" She looked at the copied request, then at her own notes, then at him. "A legal claim." His eyes stayed on her face. "Part of the current territorial structure rests on agreements built after the Durin records were buried. If the founding line was never lawfully extinguished, then the Crown's present authority over that section is compromised." She kept her voice even, because the content did not need emphasis. "I have a documented claim to 1/3 of the territory you govern." Silence settled between them and did not break quickly. Outside, a guard crossed the corridor, boots on wood, then distance again. Roran did not look back at the documents. He looked only at her. There was no visible recoil in him, no defensive response, no immediate turn toward strategy. He absorbed the sentence in full and held it there. Then he asked, "What do you want to do with it?" She had prepared for resistance, for negotiation, for the first instinct of a ruler confronted with a legitimate challenge to inherited power. She had not prepared for that question. Her hand remained on the open ledger. "I haven't decided." "Then decide before anyone else decides for you." It was not an order, not pressure, not even advice stated as advice. Just the clean placement of the question back where it belonged. Something in her went very quiet. For 3 years, the treaty had been a problem to solve. In the capital, it had become evidence, leverage, risk, motive. Even Severin's offer had treated it as a force that would act through her, whether she wanted it or not. Roran was the first person to return agency to its proper owner. She looked down at the copied request again, because looking at him felt suddenly less manageable than it had been 10 seconds earlier. "I'll decide once I have the full record arranged." He accepted that with a slight incline of his head. They stayed at the table long after the work itself should have ended. She ordered the notes by sequence. He read every page she placed in front of him. Once, their hands reached for the same sheet at the same moment. His fingers touched the side of hers and then withdrew immediately. No apology, no comment. The contact stayed behind anyway. Near midnight, Pen appeared in the doorway, took in the two of them at the table, the spread of documents, the untouched second cup of water near Roran's elbow, and said, "We ride back at first light." Roran looked up. "You should sleep." Pen's expression did not alter. "That was my conclusion." He left. Faye lowered her eyes to the ledger to keep from smiling. When she looked up again, Roran was watching her with an expression too open to belong to the court and too brief to be examined for long. They packed the documents before dawn. Tessa provided certified copies and sealed statements of retention. Faye checked each line before the wax cooled. Roran thanked the archivist personally. Pen arranged the escort before the eastern sky had cleared. As they rode out of Halvern, the copied request sat inside Faye's leather case with the seal intact. By noon, the road curved west toward the capital, forest on both sides. The soldiers kept their spacing. Penn remained at the front. Roran rode beside her for most of the afternoon. Neither of them said much. They did not need to. The question he had asked the night before remained between them, not pressing, not withdrawn. Her answer had not changed. She needed the sequence complete. She needed the record ordered. She needed, before anything else, to decide what of the legal truth she meant to turn into action and what she meant to preserve without weaponizing. Near dusk, they made camp in a clearing above the ridge road. This time, when she opened the ledger after the fire was built, Roran came and sat beside her before she asked him anything at all. He took the top copy from the stack and began reading under the firelight while she wrote the next page in the chain. They said little after that. He took the top copy from the stack and read under the firelight while she wrote the next page in the chain. The paper moved softly beside her, and when his shoulder touched the edge of her sleeve once, neither of them adjusted. They returned to the capital on the 5th day of the 4th week. The gates opened before Penn had finished the approach signal, which meant the departure had been tracked and the return anticipated by someone with access to the gate rotation. Penn noted it without comment. Roran noted Penn noting it. Faye, riding between them, had her ledger in her saddlebag and the Halvern copies sealed in the leather case. And she was thinking about the sequence in which to present the evidence, not what it proved. She knew what it proved. She was thinking about the order in which each document would be placed before the council, so that the chain assembled itself in front of them without requiring explanation, so that by the time the final document was laid on the table, the conclusion had been reached by every person in the room before she stated it. Roran called the council session for the morning of the 3rd day after their return. She used both days before it. The first day she spent in the archive organizing the complete body of evidence into a single sequential record. She began at the Halvern transmittal entry, the earliest point in the documented chain, and built forward. The certified copy of the Crown request, the itemized transfer list, the receiving signature. Then the court archive's own records, the original inventory entry, the amendment laid over it, the calligrapher's confirmation. Then the 17 altered documents in chronological order, with her dating methodology appended to each. Then the 3 supporting gaps in the surrounding border records. Then the Halvern certified statement of non-return. 41 pages, ordered. No editorial commentary. No argued conclusion. Each document followed the next, the way a sentence follows the one before it. Penn appeared at the archive entrance that evening and stood looking at the 3 tables she had covered. "He won't sleep tonight," Penn said. She did not ask who. "Neither will I." Penn looked at the layout. "You want me to arrange the council chamber before morning?" She stood and handed him the arrangement sketch she had drawn on the back of her notes page. He took it without comment and left. On the 2nd day, Roran came to the archive, not with questions, not to review the sequence. He sat in the chair at the secondary table while she made her final check pass, and he remained there while she confirmed each document number against the ledger index. When she finished and set the last page in the stack, she looked at him. "It will hold," he said. She capped her pencil. Yes. He stayed another hour. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Whatever you propose in that room tomorrow," he said, "I want to hear it before they do." She looked at him. "Not to change it. To understand it before I vote," she told him. Simply what she intended to propose, in what order, with what reasoning. He listened the way he always listened, without managing his expression in real time. When she finished, he stood at the door for a moment longer. Then he nodded and left. The council chamber was set when she arrived. Penn had placed the documents in the exact arrangement of her sketch. The chamber held 12 council members, 7 department heads, Penn at the door, and Roran at the head of the horseshoe. Morning light came through 4 high windows. Severin arrived last. He came without visible hurry and took the far chair with the ease of a man who had occupied this room for 4 decades. He looked at the documents on the central table without fixing on any one of them. He was reading the arrangement. She saw it in the single slow pass of his eyes. She stood at the table's near end and waited until the room was still. "I'll begin with the Halvern transmittal ledger," she said. She did not introduce herself. She did not set the context. She placed the first document in the center and read the entry aloud. The date, the request, the itemized list, the receiving signature. Then she set the certified copy of the original request beside it. She let the room read. A council member to the west spoke first. "When did this transfer occur?" 61 years ago, 3rd month. She moved to the second set. The inventory amendment held at an angle to show the original entry underneath. The calligrapher's confirmation. The 6 matching hands from the same year. The amendment initialed here belongs to the chief advisor of that period. She moved through the sequence. Severin began speaking on the 7th document. He was precise. He did not deny the removal. The Halvern materials made that a losing position. He argued context instead. Administrative centralization during a period of territorial instability. An oversight of return, not a policy. Standard maintenance for the archive amendments, natural accumulation for the surrounding gaps. His argument was sophisticated. The argument of someone who had spent decades knowing which explanations held weight in rooms like this. He spoke without effort. Faye waited until he finished. Then she set the 13th document on the table. This boundary clause was inserted into a document that predates it by 22 years. The ink composition is consistent with the period of the amendment. The pen pressure is heavier. The letter forms are wider. She held it steady. This is not maintenance. This is a replacement. She moved to the 14th document, then the 15th. Severin responded to each point. His arguments remained good, the best available to someone defending a 61-year position with the original materials no longer in his hands. Several council members followed him closely. The room was divided, and it stayed divided through the 20th document and the 25th. By the 30th, the room had changed. Not loudly, not at a single turning point. One council member leaning in, then another. A question answered with a document already waiting to answer it. A boundary record placed beside the replacement clause, the discrepancy visible without commentary. By the 36th document, Severin had stopped responding item by item. He had moved to the higher argument, territorial stability. The cost of restructuring agreements that had stood for 60 years, the harm to the people organized around them. She let him make it in full. When he finished, she let a beat pass. "The argument for stability is real," she said. "I am not disputing its weight." She moved the 37th document into position. "I am establishing that the arrangements at issue were built over a deliberate removal of legal record. The stability question and the factual question are not the same question." She set the final document, the Halvern non-return statement, at the end of the row. The Durin Compact was not revoked. It was buried. Those are different things, and the difference is documented. Silence ran through the chamber. Severin was the one who broke it. He spoke quietly, and what he said was not another argument. "My father believed it was necessary." A pause. He believed the removal prevented a fragmentation of the border territories that would have cost more lives than the record's absence cost in rights. He believed the calculation was sound. The pause this time was longer. "I have never known how to determine whether he was right. I have spent 61 years trying." The words landed differently than anything else spoken in the chamber that morning. Not a confession, not a defense. The final exhale of a man whose endurance had simply run out. Faye looked at him for the first time since she had begun. His face had not collapsed. It had not become dramatic. It had settled into something that looked like the specific exhaustion of a weight finally set down. Not because he had chosen to set it down, but because the ground had shifted under it and the carrying was over. The senior council member to Roran's right spoke. "The documentary record before us establishes a deliberate removal of founding materials and a subsequent pattern of archival alteration." Roran said, "Confirmed." The vote on Severin's position moved quickly. Formal removal from the role of chief advisor, full investigative review of all archival amendments under his tenure, no further determination pending completion of that review. Severin received it with the same stillness. He rose and left the chamber without ceremony. No performance, just a man who had walked through this door many times, leaving it for the last time, and who had known, somewhere beneath all the preparation, that this was what the morning held. The door closed. Roran's attention moved from the door to her. She had one more thing. She stood at the head of the table with the full sequence in front of her and the council still in their seats. Before we close, there is the matter of the territorial claim. The room sharpened immediately. The documented chain establishes my connection to the Durin founding line and the validity of the invocation I performed at the northern border. Under the treaty's own terms, that connection carries formal rights over approximately 1/3 of the territory currently governed by the Crown. A council member to the left opened his mouth. "I am not claiming it," she said. Silence settled again, different in character this time. "What I am proposing is this." She set her hands flat on the table. Formal restoration of the Durin lineage, records to the court archive, with permanent retention and proper cataloging. Public recognition of the founding compact as a valid historical document, not as an active territorial claim, but as part of the kingdom's legal foundation. Establishment of a preservation protocol for records of extinct pack lines to prevent any future removal of founding documentation. And the creation of a permanent court archivist position for historic records with mandate and resources to maintain that protocol. She looked along the horseshoe without hurrying. "I am proposing to do formally and permanently what I have been doing independently for 7 years, with the record intact and a mandate that cannot be quietly reversed." No one spoke immediately. She watched the council absorb it, test it against what they had anticipated. The proposal did what the room had been struggling to reconcile since the first document was laid on the table. It restored the factual record without detonating the territorial structure built over it. It acknowledged the legal foundation, preserved the evidence, and placed the archive under a mandate stronger than any individual office. Even the members most resistant to disruption could see the pragmatism in that. The first vote came from the eastern seat, in favor. Then the southern. The long table moved. Roran voted without hesitation. It passed without a dissenting mark. The formal documentation took 3 days. Restoration orders, protocol mandate, the position appointment, which she read 4 times before signing. On the 4th day, Penn reported that Severin had left for his family's holding in the north. Roran had made clear before the session closed that the investigation would follow through official channels. It would. On the 5th day, the archive was quiet. She had been working since first light on the restoration sequence, the order in which the removed records would be re-entered into the official catalog. Accession notes for each item. Slow, detailed work. She did not mind that. She was halfway through the 4th restoration entry when she heard the door, not Penn. She knew Penn's cadence now, the slight delay on the left foot. She looked up. Roran stood in the entrance. Not in formal wear. Dark shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, no sword belt. His hair was fractionally less ordered than it had been in the council chamber. He had the look of a man who had finished the part of the day that required him to be anything in particular. He carried no document. No question was written in his face. He had no stated purpose she could read in his posture. She put her pencil down. He crossed the room and sat on the floor beside her chair, back against the shelf, one knee drawn up. He reached for the document stack to his right, pulled the top item off, and began reading. She looked at him. He did not explain himself. She looked at him for a long time. Not assessing, not running the kind of analysis she applied to everything in her field of attention. She looked at him the way you finally look at something that has been present for weeks and is only now fully visible. And she understood, with the specific clarity of someone trained to recognize what was missing from a record, that this was not the arrival of something new. This was the recognition of something that had always been there. The man on the floor of her archive had given her access and asked direct questions and sat beside her at campfires and asked what she wanted to do, and had asked nothing in return that she had not already chosen to give. The work was resolved. The session was closed. The documents were being filed. There was no strategic reason left for him to walk through that door. He was here because he wanted to be. Her wolf had been quiet her whole life, not absent, present the way an instrument is present before anyone plays it. She had grown up in Vile, sensing the edges of a world that expressed itself through forms she could not access, feeling hierarchy and bond pull and belonging as whether she moved through without being moved by. She had learned to work alongside all of it her entire life. It moved through her now, not as a surge. It settled, patient and even, the way things settle that have been waiting for the right conditions to arrive. She felt him feel it too. His stillness shifted from concentration to something more careful, the stillness of a man making no movement that could disturb a present moment he did not want to disturb. She turned back to the restoration entry. Her hand was steady on the pencil. He turned a page. They stayed like that while the archive light moved from white to amber. Neither spoke. Outside the window, the city moved through its late afternoon. Carts, voices, a bell marking the hour from somewhere in the East Quarter. All of it distant. She reached the bottom of the fourth entry and turned to a fresh page. He shifted beside her, a small adjustment of his back against the shelf. The sounds of a person settling in for a long stay. He reached for the next document and read it in the fading light. She had worked alone for 7 years. She did not intend to revise that history or diminish what it had built. The work had been real. It had been hers. She had made every mile of it with her own hands. But the archive felt different with him in it. Not lacking before, just different now. She wrote the first line of the fifth entry. The mate bond carried no ceremony. It did not arrive as declaration or claiming or the sudden fire she had read about in bonded pair records. It arrived as recognition, a name placed on something already present. The way a document finally correctly catalogued takes its right position in a sequence that was always waiting for it. She kept writing. He kept reading. The archive held them both in the quiet, the restored record surrounding them, the evening coming in at the high windows, and neither of them moved to name what the room had become or to hurry past the particular stillness of two people who had arrived, without announcement, at exactly where they intended to stay. The end.